Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Linn Tabak. I will moderate today's discussion. Our topic is the future of standardized testing. To help us explore this subject, we have three guests. One comes from the ACT, Kenton. He is the Senior Director of Higher Education Strategy and Engagement. I also have with me my colleague from Cornell College, Kauper, who's a professor of education and is taking a turn helping us in the dean's office as well. Is that associate dean or assistant dean there? What do we call it?
Associate dean.
Associate dean. And Drew Shradel is also my colleague at Cornell College and is our director of admission right now. And I want to say, I usually don't do this, but say a few words of introduction for myself too. I teach computer science here, and I have a special interest in our topic as I've worked for many years in support of the advanced placement program, and we might get a chance to talk about that as well. So I want to ask each of you to say a little bit more about your background, your interest in this topic, and then we'll get to the real meat of the discussion. Kenton, do you want to begin at ACT? Tell us your role there, how you came to that role, and so on.
I'd be happy to. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. It's really great to be here today. I serve as the Senior Director for Higher Education Strategy and Engagement. And in that role, I draw upon my experience as a practitioner, an enrollment management dean and director. And I've been at institutions around the country, both private institutions and mid-sized public schools, as well as spending some time prior to beginning in the U.S. I worked in Canada. And so in my work at ACT, I'm really privileged to have the opportunity to help us as an organization remain cognizant and aware of the needs that higher education folks have as they use the test and ultimately as folks serve students. And so it's in that capacity that I am here today. And my experience as a practitioner was pretty extensive and included extensive use of the test. I used ACT significantly. So I'm really glad to be here and look forward to this conversation.
Okay, very good. Kate, you want to say a few words about yourself?
Sure thing. Hello, everybody. My name is Kate Kauper, and I come to this conversation with a background in high school and middle school education. I began teaching right at the dawn of No Child Left Behind, the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which then launched a nationwide effort to use standardized testing for accountability measures for schools in a way that had not been seen before. So from that background, I went into higher education, and I've studied how the curriculum has altered since No Child Left Behind.
Good. And Drew, tell us about your background and your role here in admissions at Cornell College.
Yeah, thanks, Linn. So I've been with Cornell College now. This is my 8th year, and I was at Cornell College actually when Cornell made the initial switch to go test optional. And then I took over as a director of admission right before the pandemic and got to see when the big wave of that came in. So I won't spoil too much because I know that we might be talking about that a little bit. But as the director of admission, obviously I handle a lot of different files and admission decisions based on test scores or test optional. I'm also involved in NACAC, the National Association of College Admission Counselors too. And so I do hear a lot of conversation happening throughout other universities and colleges throughout the country, talking about their decision to either go test optional or go back to the test score. So there's a lot of discussion.
Now, I think for everybody on the panel here, it's part of our upbringing, part of our memory that sitting for the ACT or the SAT in the junior and senior year of high school was everybody who was headed towards college did that. We just took that for granted. And I think it might be good, before we talk about why some colleges no longer require these tests, if we look backward in time and see where they originated, what their purpose was. So I'm hoping, Kenton, you can give us a little history there.
Yeah, I sure can. So the history of standardized testing began before the history of ACT. Really, ACT, we began with our first test, and I think it was 1959. But it was in response to the assessment, the SAT that had been in place since the early 1900s. I think it was 1926 or so that the College Board began administering the Scholastic Aptitude Test, which that is no longer an apt acronym. It's just the SAT. But the founder of of ACT, in the late 1950s, determined that there was a better way, a different way that he wished to introduce to the testing space. And so the assessment began in 1959 as a measure of college and career readiness, measurement of the skills and abilities that students needed to have in hand for them to achieve success at the college level. And so that's the beginning. And lots of changes have happened over the intervening years to where we find ourselves today, where both assessments, the SAT and the ACT, in large measure actually are measuring similar things in that we both now measure the information that students, the knowledge that students need to have in order for them to be successful in college. And it's based upon that curriculum focus. It's always been ACT's focus, that curriculum approach, whereas the SAT began as an aptitude assessment and then more recently adapted their approach. So that's a very high level, simple approach or a summary there, but I hope that provides a bit of a starting point.
So our program will be published on YouTube, and viewers from around the world might see this. So I think it's important to say that we are speaking from Iowa. Kenton is in Minnesota, but we're all here close to where the ACT made its offices. Mm-hmm. So this is a local industry for us here at Cornell College. Drew, tell us a little bit about what's happened in recent years. How many colleges are moving away from requiring these tests? Do you have a sense of who's taking advantage of this option? Are colleges now committed to this course? Tell us a little bit of what's happened in the recent history with these tests.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Cornell College decided to go test optional, I think, when it was much more fringe to even think about the possibility of going test optional. And so we've been test optional for about 6 years now. At that time, there was a lot of different ways of going test optional. There were some additional things you wanted to do. Still more students were taking the test than they were going test optional. But then obviously the pandemic happened and a lot of schools ended up going test optional out of necessity versus out of maybe want or design. And so it's really been the last 2 years where we've seen multiple schools end up going test optional and in a lot of different ways. I think that where many schools, and I use Cornell as an example, obviously, because it's what I know, where we designed, we took the time, we worked with our faculty, we designed an application that we felt was a great way of being able to holistically review a file and also make a good conscious decision on if the student would be academically fit to succeed at Cornell. The pandemic kind of forced schools into making that decision very quickly. Schools that would never probably have gone test optional otherwise. And so what we found during the pandemic was a lot of different policies. Some were test optional for application. Some were test optional for admission. Some were still required a test score then for scholarship. Many schools still to this day say, oh, we're test optional for next year, or we're only test optional for this year. We're still thinking about next year. And so I think where we're seeing some questions about how test optional will be used, especially in the higher realm of higher ed, it's kind of where that gray area finally ends and where some of those decisions are finally made. And so I think what we're seeing is that many schools are using test optional as a great way of increasing accessibility to college. It eliminates a few hurdles when it comes to applying for students, especially applying early. But I think there's still some schools that are working out some kinks and trying to figure out how exactly that policy is going to fit into kind of the future of the school and their enrollment.
Okay. Kate, I'd like your help in finding the right place for standardized tests versus our other means of evaluating students, guiding students, and so on. So I begin with this comment to prompt you. When I teach here at Cornell College, I might write an exam on Thursday, give it on Friday, grade it on Saturday. My work for the advanced placement program has taught me just how hard it is to construct a measure that's meaningful. Sometimes we test what's easiest to test rather than what's most meaningful. And while I ask my students to write their answers in a blue book, and I fold the page back so I'm not biased by the student's name, and I shuffle the book so I'm not biased by the order in which they completed the exam, and I grade all the answers to question 1 first before I go to question 2 so I don't get some bias in the momentum as I go. You know, I can't be as objective and consistent in my own weekly exams as one of these testing organizations can when they put in a whole year's effort and they have a whole system in place. So talk a little bit about where the standardized tests mean, what standardized means, and how other evaluations might fit in here.
Sure, absolutely. So I appreciate that you're bringing up the topic of bias when it comes to standardized tests. And I give a lot of credit to and I have a lot of respect for people who design these tests, standardized tests, because they try to control for these forms of bias, from construct bias, which is an error in the measurement of the skill. For example, if an item is looking to measure verbal skills, but instead measuring listening skills. And then there's method bias, which is an error in the sample of students. And then there's item bias, which is something that we might often be prone to when we're creating tests like you're describing. And that's where the test question itself is somewhat ambiguous or might result in a low or high familiarity among certain test takers over others because of perhaps cultural influences. And so all of these things need to be controlled for in the creation of a standardized test. And there are many systems and mechanisms in place in order to prevent those biases from being present. Is it always perfect? No. And I think that the history of standardized testing reveals a very long history of this bias, but it has been a gradual improvement over time. In terms of not remembering the second part of your question, but in terms of what a standardized test is, perhaps maybe just a little bit of overview of what it means to have or to implement a standardized test. The idea of a standardized test is that it is valid and reliable and it is comparative. You're measuring a point in time in a student's knowledge and skills, and the students are experiencing all the same test so that you can have a comparable sample of what the outcomes are from the test results. So while assessment is a very, very broad field and might include elements of formative assessment and informal assessments, standardized assessment is a very controlled form of examination. So I hope that's kind of what you were asking about.
Yes. Well, I want to go back to Drew and ask him what else he's looking for in the student's portfolio, and whether he believes that absent a standardized test, he's getting all the information he needs to help us make these decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the transcript can tell you a whole lot. And one of the things that made us decide to go test optional and feel comfortable with that is that we felt like we had a lot of students who were going through the application process, and you saw these 4.0 students who had taken AP courses, students who were IB students who were taking 4 years of math and English, and they'd come in and they'd have a pretty average ACT. You're looking 23, maybe 24 type of range. And when you have a application review policy and process that looks at those things, you can't ignore it. And so, that student then kind of gets pushed into more of the middle ground territory. Well, when you take the test score out and you can review it even more holistically, now you're looking at a student for not just what they bring to the table academically, although, again, a 4.0 student's a 4.0 student, but what else are they involved in? You find students who work and help their family pay the bills. That's a student that can work really hard in the classroom. And for us, for admission offices, I think most admission offices in most schools, they like to see the hard work, right? They like to see the work that you put in daily in the classroom. You're going to class, you're getting your homework done, you're turning in the assignments, you're showing up and you're putting in that work. And sometimes the test score is kind of like, well, that was one day. And so if you only took it once, maybe you took it twice, that day could have been an off day for you. It could have been rough. And I think for us, that's how we saw it, is that the transcript was a better evaluation of a student over a long period of time. What was their work ethic like? And what is that going to show when they come to college? Versus, okay, well, if we're looking at that, but we're also looking at this one point in time that's hurting them, is that really fair to that student? And so offering this opportunity that they can give us a couple of additional writing samples showing us how they understand the liberal arts institution, how they understand what major they want to go into, what's their understanding of just the work that's going to be put in. We can take it on a very much, again, that holistic feel and say, this is a student who's not going to be just a student here, but a great community person, and build up our institution better on all levels.
Okay. So this is a question for all of you. My dim memories of the distant past when I applied to college was that I bought a big, thick book, and it had a description of a different college on each page. And at the top of that page was a list of the average scores of students admitted to that school. And so there was a lot of self-selection. Students who were ambitious could look at the most selective schools, and they could say, I've got a chance here, and maybe not such a good chance here. And this is part of the way they decided. Talk about how this change in test optional has affected the number of applications at some of these schools, and how students are now deciding whether they are a good match for especially these most selective colleges and universities. Any one of you here?
I think you make ask a good question here, because the college testing process has served as a way for students to, as you say, sort of self-select and to kind of make the decision about where they wish to enroll, or at least seek enrollment. And a lot of things will still take time to kind of sort of resolve to the new normal, as test optionality likely is going to carry on and continue. But one thing we saw during the pandemic, specifically around the Ivy Leagues, super selective institutions, is that everyone, many students who would otherwise maybe not have put themselves in the pool for consideration. We saw just at the Ivy Leagues a couple of years ago, we saw about 300,000 more students apply to the Ivy Leagues. Excuse me, I think it was 84,000 in addition than the prior years. So it was like 385,000 or so applied to the Ivy Leagues. The Ivy Leagues only admitted 18,000 students across them all. In fact, it was fewer that year than in prior years. And so the more applicants to the pool did not mean more students got in, right? It was actually just more students got rejection letters. And I think that this, the process is imperfect still, and it's going to require a resolution, right, to a sort of a new normal as institutions and students figure out how to find that alignment when there's limited information.
Any other comments on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Kenton here. I mean, that's something that we noticed as well. You had students who otherwise would never have applied to Harvard or Columbia or any Ivy, and yet when this test optional option came around, they thought, well, here's my chance. And it also kind of does some things with the rankings. And Leon, if you want another show to do, you can do it over rankings, college rankings. I'm happy to talk about that as well. But what I will say is that I don't think that the ACT or the SAT is necessarily bad in any way. And I think that there is a place for it, especially in some of these schools that have so many students applying. And, you look at a place like take the University of Iowa, for an example, you have so many students there, so many students who apply, they don't have the staff in order to holistically review every single one of those files. The amount of time it would take to get through all those files and get an answer back to those students, you're going to be down a long line. And so I do think that test optional does have a home, and I think it has a place. I think the test score has a home and a place, and I think there's also a lot of in-between schools that can decide whether or not it's right for them or not right for them. But I do think that some of these schools that do have these really large application numbers haven't figured it out yet, and may go back to test optional like MIT, or the test score like MIT has. And I don't know if I can blame them. I mean, when you have that many applications, there has to be a way to be able to sift through that and determine, okay, well, who's going to be here and who's not. What's the retention going to be there?
And I agree with everything that's been said here, and I also I kind of wonder about the residual effects of a nationwide movement or even a global-wide movement to test optional. There are other mechanisms for sorting and selecting students, and these may have undesirable outcomes as well. We have heard critics of standardized tests say that they are inequitable, that they privilege students who have had more access to test preparation resources. But the same might be true if you're looking at, for example, grade point averages of students or the extracurriculars that they're involved in. Those do tend to align with students who have more social capital or cultural capital that to access some of those extracurriculars and the educational resources that make them look good to admissions councils. And so I agree with Drew that a holistic view, a 360-degree view of a student is what is ideal, because there are multiple measurements of aptitude that are applied, and a standardized test only measures a point in time. So schools that are smaller and have the capability to look at students in that 360-degree view will have that opportunity to use tests as just one of many measures.
So Kate, I want to ask you something more along the same lines. Is it the case that some high schools are now requiring all students to take one of these tests? Are there some schools paying for students to take some of these tests? Is that distorting the purpose or the value of these tests? So I'll start with you. Maybe others have a comment on that.
Sure. Well. Yes. So students do have access to take the ACT and SAT during school. This is part of the ESSA. And as well as an element of No Child Left Behind from 2002. So students do have access to take these tests. And that I think that this is actually really a good thing, that if we make the tests more available to students and more affordable to students, we're probably going to have better access to data and I'm not just even talking about ACTs and SATs. I'm talking about other types of data that can serve as a diagnostic for where we might be lacking in certain resources in certain areas in certain regions. So I actually do see it as a good thing to have access to these exams.
To add that not only, I mean, I totally agree with you, Kate, but not only is it a good thing, but more schools and states and districts are opting for this opportunity than they ever have before. We have seen at ACT the largest volume, the largest increase in the number of states and districts and high schools who are opting for this opportunity for students to take the test in the school day, because it has been shown to provide an opportunity for students who may not otherwise take the test to have access. And, you know, one of the things I think that gets lost in some of these conversations is that test optional or test optionality that results in fewer students taking the test may be seen as leveling the playing field, but at the end of the day, the test is often for the college-going apparatus that is nationwide has been an essential part of getting students onto the field of play for them to be recruited and to be part of the experience of being encouraged to go to college. And so there's some unintended consequences there. Part of the outcome of expanded in-school testing is this effect of more students actually getting on the playing field so that institutions can reach out and serve them.
All righty, we're very near the end of our half hour, so I'd like you to think about final remarks you might want to make to the audience. These tests were very valuable to me. They were instrumental in helping me reach my goals. Maybe you want to comment, somebody, if we have just a few seconds, maybe you want to comment on which students should be choosing to take these, even when they are optional, and how they can benefit students even in the absence of a requirement. But you've got kind of 1 minute apiece, and to say whatever you like in parting to our audience.
Well, I'll just quick, Leon, since I'm the admission guy, I'll talk about for students who, which ones choose which. I think it's really what you want to show. And so if you feel like you have so much more to show and you can do that in a writing piece or a portfolio piece, I think a test optional or no test application would be great for you. If you're a very academically minded student, you want to go with the test score, that's totally fine too. The last thing I'll say is whether a school requires a test score or a school is test optional or doesn't require it at all. I think the one thing I would say, is probably the most unethical is leaving it gray. And so, for schools to make a decision, tell us one way or the other, because students want to know, and they want to know, am I a junior and I'm going to be able to apply this way, or is it going to be totally different by the time I get there?
I see. Okay. Another?
Well, I think, the best way for a student to know whether or not they should submit a test is to have a test to determine whether or not they wish to submit it. And I think that it's up to the student, and it's okay. But I need to call out that, Cornell has a really robust holistic review process. My limited review of the website and hearing this conversation, you all have a thoughtful way of managing the holistic review of students. Many institutions don't. And so this calculation is different at every institution, but I think there's value in students having a test to make that calculation on their own.
Okay. Kate?
I'm inclined to want more data points than fewer. So I encourage students to think about what having this test score might offer them or what it might illuminate for them, but also with the reminder that everyone is more than what their test score is. Tests don't measure everything about a person and their outcomes and their abilities and their aspirations. And I think it's a valuable data point, and yet it is not the be all and end all of what the outcomes will possibly be for students.
All right, and my parting words, I have more than 30 years, closer to 40 years of teaching experience now, and time on task, effort, attitude, these things are what count. If you're a student or you're a parent and you're anxious about these scores, there are lots of opportunities for you, lots of teachers who want to work with you. If you're willing to put in the effort and work with us, we're happy to have you. I think people at many different levels here can make great contributions. And I see lots of nodding heads. Is that right? Are we all agreed on that?
Completely.
And, this topic brings me together with many great people in my grading of the AP exams. And tonight and today on Ethical Perspectives on the News, Drew and Kate, I already know pretty well, and I'm glad to meet you, Kenton. And thank you all in our audience for joining us today. And we hope to see you next time on another episode of Ethical Perspectives on the News. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Kenton. And bye-bye, audience. Okay.